Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Hey everybody, welcome to JVB Live. It is in the evening here in Hawaii, so late in the morning on the East Coast in COVID country up there in New York State where I'm from. Um, 10 o'clock here in Hawaii, the 13th, first part of the week. Stock market was weird this morning. I'm making a habit, one of the things I'm trying to work on personally while I'm not employed actively at the time is to understand the stock market, get into trading, buying and selling stocks. I had bad experience a couple of years ago and let that impact me for the last 15 years. And so with extra free time on my hand, I figured I'd get disciplined and try to wake up and early and start to understand the stock market. So that's one of the things I've tried to do to increase my talent stack during this mandatory forced vacation in your house. The other thing is to get good with these live casts. So I'm trying to get good practice at this. I think this is my 13th or so in the last couple weeks. So if you have watched it, thank you. Thank you to family and friends who've given me feedback. If you find yourself here from my Twitter network or other networks, please feel free to drop me a line and let me know what you think. I know that we'll probably disagree on things politically or socially or philosophically, religiously, whatever. That's okay. If you see something, want to make a comment, I'm happy to. I'm all ears to get your feedback. Other personal goals, what are you guys working on? I'm working on exercise, diet. Today I did a real nice dumbbell routine. I'm doing a lot of uh, uh, high intensity interval training, HIIT workouts, and I'm doing the dumbbells and kettlebells, and I'm finding that's really nice because it keeps my workouts short. I heard recently that men over the age of 40, if they can keep their workouts between 20 and 25 minutes, that maximizes your human growth hormone and minimizes your stress hormones because once you go over 30 minutes, your stress hormones start to spike, and stress hormones are no good for your health. So if you could keep that to the human growth hormone and avoid the stress hormone, you're doing well in your workouts. So I do that by timing and then also trying to get my diet right. I my morning, my diet up through about 3 p.m. is pretty good. And then in the evening hours when I'm doing bedtime with the kids, I start to get distracted and I think my diet starts to drift off a little bit in the evenings. Plus, when I do these live streams, I have to do a little glass of scotch in honor of single malt skull sessions from 12 years ago. So isn't that apt? Kirkland 12, getting the real fancy stuff. But hey, not a lot of money to spend on things like high-end scotches. So cheers. Anyway, so what are you guys working on? Like I said, my big two things are learn the stock market and do these live streams. And I don't really care that I don't have an audience. I can get onesies and twosies here and there. I'm just trying to build the practice and get comfortable with talking extemporaneously with some notes, some preparation, and hopefully provide you guys value with my way of thinking about things accumulated over the last 20 plus years of professional and military experience, and a little bit of academic experience in there too. So of course, over the weekend we had all these remote shows that videoed in their performances. So Saturday Night Live had that. Bill Maher had an interesting monologue on the China virus, which got a lot of criticism from from social media. And my brother even sent me a remote choir performance in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which was pretty phenomenal. There were, on the screen, each performer's face, almost like the old Hollywood Squares, if anybody's old enough to remember that show. But probably five or six performers across, and maybe five or six different rows. I mean, there's a wide number of performers, and they were all singing this from their houses via streaming service, and the outcome was pretty spectacular. It was really nice. So it was really cool. My brother's in that choir, again, out of Fredericksburg, Virginia. So, what people are doing is pretty inspiring, at least to me. So I thought I'd mention that. But Bill Maher got a lot of flack. He did this monologue on on the corona, the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, where COVID-19 came out of, and uh, I saw this a couple days ago, and I was just stunned, and I wanted to kind of go over this thread to kind of show the the danger of Twitter if you're not really a critical thinker, or as I like to call it, a grown up thinker in these conversations. I like to have grown up conversations, not child conversations. But sadly, this thread is kind of a child thread, written by Noah Berlatsky. So he writes this tweet that says Bill Maher is a racist, misogynist, Islamophobic shithead. F him. He didn't use F, he used the full word. I was like, that's random. He must have done something that would offend him. And then I started to read down. It's pretty disheartening. So he continues his thread. It's pretty disheartening that one of the most prominent Dem media voices is a guy whose views are largely indistinguishable from MAGA, except that he says mean things about Trump. Every so often, conservatives are like, if you cancel Ben Shapiro, we'll cancel Bill Maher. And I'm always like, well, why haven't you then? What's the effing holdup? So, so he's pretty upset. And then I start to read the replies to them. And the first reply is just so funny. I don't even know, I don't even have to know what he said or did to agree with this evergreen sentiment. Racist anti-Asian BS was the reply to that. And I'm just going to keep reading the replies. It never ends. There's something that happens. There's something that happens to white men in their later years, especially those who have achieved financial success. Their wires get crossed and they go nuts. It's bizarre and terrifying. True, but Maher has always been awful, as far as I can tell. So that's Noah replying to one of his repliers. He's getting much worse. Hubby thinks Trump's victory is making everyone let their worst instincts come out in the open. He was an apologetic racist a decade ago. So it's just so funny. I don't know or care what he did this time, liking this because it's just true. So what was amazing to me about this thread is people didn't even look at what Bill Maher had posted. They didn't even look. They just saw the tweet and agreed and replied that they agreed. And this is just a textbook. So I tweeted this. I said, this is a textbook example of confirmation bias. And my friend Greg in France reminded me that this is also a tell for cognitive dissonance when you're giving insults like this. No thinking involved. So notice that people didn't even take the time to go look at the context. What was it that aggravated people? And oftentimes what I've found when I do that is the the really strong narrative that's presented just kind of goes away, or the conclusion that's been presented as absolutely, worst case, the worst possible light thing that's happened. You go to the context, you're like, where is it? I don't see it. And so that's what I did. I went to, I started to tweet this because I thought this was amazing that people wouldn't actually go and see what he said in order to comment and agree with this tweeter. And so I started to write my comment about confirmation bias without going to the video. And I realized I was about to do the same thing, right? So I went to the video, I Googled it and saw Bill Maher's 5-minute closing segment on the Chinese virus. And he just pulls no punches. He just goes after the PC crowd and says, get over it. This originated from China, and calling it a Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus is not racist. It's just a reference to where it came from, and then gives other examples. And he does it in his Bill Maher clever way. Now, I'm indifferent to Bill Maher. Like I don't really like his brand of comedy. I don't dislike his brand of comedy. He's opposite sides of me politically. I appreciate his perspective, and certainly what drew me to more into Bill Maher's fan base, and I'm not really a fan, but I'm warm to him, was the whole Ben Affleck Sam Harris debate from years ago on Islam. You could YouTube that one, and I just thought good for Bill Maher for standing his ground and what he knows is right and what he believes. So, and Sam Harris, I like Sam Harris. He's one of my favorite atheists. I'm not an atheist. I'm a Christian. Um, so anyway, so I went and I looked at the video and I thought, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This is the stuff that is being labeled racist, misogynist, Islamophobic. I just, you know, it it didn't even match what the context was. Like the video, he pulls punches with the PC culture, but he doesn't say anything negative about people. He doesn't. He does say that China's responsible, and he says China's responsible. China's responsible for this virus, which in fact they are. So anyway, I tweeted that and I thought that was a pretty interesting exercise in exactly what, how irrational people are and think with their emotions, vice their intellect and vice their reason. Um, I used to be a person, just as an aside, I grew up in a very rational household. And, my family, my mom's dad and her family really favored rational, the use of reason. In fact, my aunt and uncle are objectivists. They follow the philosophy of Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead and The Virtue of Selfishness and other works. And by the way, Atlas Shrugged is a phenomenal read. And if you want to know about objectivism and you want to read a good read that's really long, then Atlas Shrugged is really good. But it's very long. It's over 1,000 pages. But so anyway, human reason, the faculty of human reason gives you all these axioms, all these truths to hold on to, going back to Greek philosophy. And so I was raised kind of just taking it for granted that people are reasonable and use reason and rationality to come up with the best solutions to problems, to explore the world around them, to commit to truth claims, to choose choose philosophical ideas that make the most sense to them, and discard other ones. The scientific method. I mean, that's an exercise in human rationality and reason. And it wasn't until recently that got turned on its head. And I would say recently, in the last 12 years or so, going into grad school and studying behavioral economics. I loved microeconomics. I loved macroeconomics, but really behavioral economics brought it home to me in terms of that's the real world. The real world is people make irrational choices all the time. They make choices based on their emotions rather than their reason. And this has been documented well in psychology literature. Great books. Um, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is a great overview of this topic. So anyway, I started to conclude that yeah, people are pretty darn irrational in terms of their decision making and their thinking. And I didn't know how bad it was. I've heard 80% irrational, 20% rational, 90% irrational, 10% rational, and I find it funny that you can go into Twitter and you can immediately find a number of threads that just prove this point. This is completely irrational or emotion based tweeting and responses to some sort of prior belief, a strongly stated prior belief, and they don't even have to look at the context. They're just hook, line, and sinker. So this is a small example of how if a major outlet, let's say the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of the major outlets, Fox News, just submits a clip of, let's say, a speech or a rally, and that there's a narrative and a conclusion based around that speech, and they push it out there. Well, like I said, people are mostly irrational. So who knows the proportion of people who are consuming that information? It's just going to confirm their prior biases, and they're going to think this is even more evidence of the evil character or the selfish character of this person, this politician, and how come those supporters can't even see this, and then they start to transmit their feelings about said politician. They start to transmit that to the supporters, perhaps, and you see this. I'm sure you've seen this. You maybe have lived this. Um, so what's interesting is if you start to go to the context of a lot of those clips. And I'll just use one example because it's a pretty well documented example, and it's the Fine People hoax. Back in Charlottesville a couple of years back, there's some rallies and Antifa showed up, and it was all about the statues back at the Southern General statues, and there was some white supremacist group. There were people who were just simply wanting to preserve the Southern culture. There was Antifa. There's a bunch of other people, and Trump spoke about the event. There was violence that broke out. Trump spoke about the event, and he said, the fine people on both sides comment. And that was taken out of context because later he clarified, I'm not talking about the white supremacists, the white nationalists. I condemn them totally. So he clarified later, but the clarification is always left out, and the fine people on both sides is always kept. And so this has been used as evidence for literally 3 years, all the way up to the present day, as proof of Trump's racism. Now, for the people who already think he's racist, this is just, further evidence of that truth. For people who take the time to go look at the fuller context, they go, wait a second, this isn't a fair, accurate representation of what happened at that, in that speech and what actually was communicated. And so this this tweet kind of gives a small example of people's willingness to leap over context. It doesn't even matter at that point. All it is a further data point to propel their already decided perspective and their already decided judgment. So anyway, I do want to cover something from yesterday before I move on. I was talking about climate change models yesterday, and I was using the current models with COVID and the difference, the scaling down of the University of Washington model from 93,000 down to 61,000 in the span of about 9 days as an example of how models can be imprecise, imperfect. All models are false. Some are useful was a quote I read yesterday from a statistician. So I was supposed to read this yesterday, but I forgot. And it was an article from the Cato Institute. And this is where, so I mentioned yesterday that the IPCC gets they basically just combine a bunch of models together, and the outcome of that model, that combination is what is presented as their findings. And so I found an article yesterday that talked about this, and I forgot to read it. So I wanted to just cover that. So this is from the Cato Institute in January of this year by a guy named Patrick J. Michaels. This also appeared in The Hill. And I just want to read some of this that kind of sets some baseline for where I fall out on the modeling discussion, especially with climate science models. So many recent climate models have been predicting dire global changes. The problem is climate forecasters currently ignore decades of scientific best practices that would offer more accurate predictions. Thankfully, there are attempts to rectify the truly dodgy methodology that has been used to crank out forecasts of 21st century climate. An important new climate paper published in Nature Climate Change, written by Victoria Uring of the University of Bremen and 28 co-authors from around the world, does just that. That's sorely needed, and here's why. Weather forecasters know that some models work better than others in specific situations, and they tend to rely on the versions that work best, depending upon the forecast problem. When the issue is a potential big snow along the eastern seaboard, forecasters usually lean upon the model from the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting, the Euro model. When diagnosing shifts in the jet stream patterns a week or 10 days ahead, they may place more weight on the American Global Forecast System model. But the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change simply averages up to 29 major climate models to come up with a forecast for warming in the 21st century, a practice rarely done in operational weather forecasting. As dryly noted in Uring and others, quote, there is now evidence that giving equal weight to each available model projection is suboptimal, end quote. Indeed, the authors of the new paper show that the aggregate models are making huge errors in 3 of the places on Earth that are critical to our understanding of climate. The first error is over the entire Southern Ocean. I'm going to not talk about the specifics, but for those of you interested, just Google Cato and climate models. Further, almost all of the moisture that precipitates over Antarctica comes from the Southern Ocean, and an enormous amount of additional water vapor in the forecasts comes from the practice of using models that raise the ocean temperature a few degrees beyond what it actually is. Another important, and I'm skipping down a couple paragraphs, another important error is along the west coast of South America. In the real world, thanks to the steady pull of the trade winds diverging water away from the coast, cold subsurface water wells up. When, for largely unknown reasons, the trade winds temporarily weaken, the surface water temperatures rise dramatically, inducing El Nino that may cause floods thousands of miles away in Southern California, which I lived through El Nino flooding. So the model also greatly underestimates a similar area of upwelling off the African coast that induces the tropical Atlantic's version of the El Nino, known as the Atlantic Nino. So basically, when you combine all these models, it's not accurately predicting what we're seeing in real life. And I mention this because, the COVID model that we are using as a nation to guide us forward, the University of Washington model, is feeding back in real-time information into the model. And it would be interesting to see how the climate change models would be feeding back the errors into the model. And I'm sure they are. But this paper suggests that basically combining them, 29 of them up to 29, and then using that as their findings is, quote, suboptimal. So I wanted to cover that because that was the context missing yesterday when I talked about modeling. And for the record, I'm very skeptical of all modeling. It doesn't matter the discipline. I think models can be useful for persuasion. They can be sometimes accurate, oftentimes not accurate. And on the issue of climate, I don't take a strong position one way or the other whether humans are causal in global climate change. I certainly think it's plausible. I don't think it's conclusive, but I support the green nuclear deal. So what I mean by that is I think that fourth generation nuclear power is the way forward, and I've promoted those ideas from people on Twitter like Mark Schneider and others. Bill Gates has done a lot of work in fourth generation nuclear. So that's where I stand. Anyway, wanted to cover that. Moving on, COVID-19. So you may have heard that some European countries are going to be lifting restrictions. So as reported out of Bloomberg, Europe's virus spread slows as lockdown easing ways are sought. So we're going to see Europe start to open up here shortly, I think, and that will be interesting to observe. A couple other things I want to point out about Europe, which is really interesting. So in the modeling and in the death rates, these alarming death rates that we've been seeing over the last 2 months, 2+ months, one thing that was missing was the number of infected. We didn't have good testing with antibodies to determine what the true denominator was of the equation that gives you the death rate. All that we had were the positive tests in the denominator with the number of deaths in the numerator. And I discussed this past week about the difficulty of nailing down the numerator and the difficulty of nailing down the denominator. And one thing I said very early on, maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago on Twitter, was it's very difficult to have good information in the models if you don't know how many people have been infected. Seems intuitive, but that's basically what it is. And if there are more people infected than get positive tests, then your death rate goes down. So, for example, in New York State, I think the death rate is still up around 3.5%, 4.5%, somewhere around there. Out where I live in Hawaii, the death rate's 1.3, and in California, it's lower. So you're seeing different death rates in different locations. One idea about that is there might have been different strains of COVID-19 that came out. I don't know if that's true. I haven't heard any more reporting on that. Another idea was that there's simply more testing in the areas with the lower death rates, and therefore you have a fatter denominator, and you're identifying more people who are infected. Whereas in the other locations like New York State or the surrounding states, you're not getting the good denominator because your testing isn't broad enough, and there are people who are asymptomatic. And I said early on, if there's people that are asymptomatic who develop low symptoms or no symptoms, that's a big problem. That's a huge confounder in the data. So, having said that, I came across a couple pieces today in The Spectator, and one is titled "How Many People Have COVID-19 and Don't Even Know It." And I want to, this basically discusses exactly what I put out there a couple weeks back. So this was written. When was this written? This was written a couple weeks ago, actually. I guess 10 days ago, 9 days ago. Just how many of us have COVID-19 and are not even aware of it? It's a question at the heart of this crisis. Epidemiologists are deeply divided and no one truly knows. Yesterday came news from China that 130 of 166 people most recently found to be infected with SARS-CoV-2 there have proved that have proved to be asymptomatic. That is to say, they had no symptoms whatsoever which would have led them to suspect they were infected. No symptoms whatsoever which would have led them to suspect that they were infected. This is consistent with research in Italy, where all 3,000 inhabitants were tested for the virus early in the Italian outbreak. There, between 50 and 75% of those infected had no symptoms either. So we're seeing this thing. The proportion of people who are asymptomatic matters hugely because the implications for the mortality rate and infection rate of the general population. We know that the cases which are being recorded are only the tip of the iceberg. Since the UK moved into the delay phase a couple of weeks ago, we are no longer even testing people unless they present at a hospital with severe symptoms. What we don't know is how large the iceberg is. If it is as big as claimed by modeling in the Oxford team led by Professor Sunatra Gupta, which suggested up to half the UK population could already be infected, then there may be no point in locking down Britain or any other country. COVID-19 is a chronic disease which has already spread through the population but will be of limited concern because it is not very deadly. That's the reason. So I found out another article from, again, The Spectator. This was written a couple days ago by a gentleman named Ross Clark, and it's called COVID Antibody Test in German Town Shows 15% Infection Rate. So they've done a test in Germany. This morning, we have some data giving a little more insight into the great unknown of the coronavirus pandemic. Just how widely among the population has SARS-CoV-2, the virus which causes COVID-19, spread among the general population? A team at the University of Bonn has tested a randomized sample of 1,000 residents of the town of Gengelt in the northwest of the country, one of the epicenters of the outbreak in Germany. And the study found that 2% of the population currently had the virus and that 14% were carrying antibodies, suggesting that they had already been infected, whether or not they experienced any symptoms. Eliminating an overlap between the two groups, the team concluded that 15% of the town had been infected with the virus. This number matters hugely because it tells us what we need to know in order to judge how deadly the virus is and how easily it spreads. It tells us ultimately how useful the methods are that we are employing in order to combat the virus. And then it references the article I mentioned first. The question of how many people already have the infection is at the heart of a debate between epidemiologists at the Imperial College and Oxford University. 2 weeks ago, the latter published modeling claiming that up to half of the UK population might already be infected. The Gengel study does not provide support for the idea that half of the population of Britain or any other country has been infected with the virus. But for a town to have an infection rate of 15% suggested the virus had spread a lot further than many believed. Niall Ferguson, who leads the Imperial team, told the Financial Times this week that he believes between 3 and 5% of the UK population has already been infected. Here's the kicker. Data from coronavirus deaths in Gengelt suggests an infection mortality rate of 0.37%, significantly below the 0.9% which Imperial College has estimated, or the 0.66% found in a revised study last week. So that's pretty impressive. Then it talks about the ship, the Diamond Princess, which had a mortality rate of 1.2%, but relatively older cohort of passengers. So if, we can't say that that's here in the US, but, it could be, we are seeing a varying degree of of mortality rates across the US states, and there's got to be a reason for that. And my hunch, my prediction is that if they've already done a randomized test in Germany, I think when they do a randomized test here in the US, which I think they were starting to do last week, Thursday, Friday, in places like San Francisco or LA County, out in Stanford area. Hopefully, we'll get more on that soon. That should be out shortly. That we're going to find something similar here in the U.S., and that's going to bring the mortality rate significantly lower. Is my optimist inside of me hope, and we will see that University of Washington model get scaled down again because I believe that their assumptions are a higher fatality rate. So that's some pretty darn good news, if you ask me, that we have some positive signs that there are people who are asymptomatic, meaning you could be infected by this virus, have zero symptoms, and then you have the antibodies, a couple weeks later. So some people, my brother, and others who are in New York State, were pretty ill in January. Didn't go get tested, didn't go to the doctor, but they were at home, pretty ill, cough, congestion, that kind of thing. And many throughout the country think that maybe this, when they were sick in January or even December, that perhaps some of that was COVID-19, and it may have gotten here a lot earlier. So I'm sure we'll find out more information in the next week. I think we're pretty close, and then we'll have a much better idea of when to open the economy. And that's on everybody's mind, right? Opening the economy, this giving up privacy, this how do we do it? Graduated, do we have to keep things closed until we can guarantee that we have that no one else is going to die? There's a bunch of trade-offs being considered, and it's interesting that the back and forth between yes, we got to open the economy, no, we got to keep it shut down, and creating this kind of fake debate based on your limited scope in your background, whether it's background in economics, background in medicine. We want to try to do both to the maximum extent practical, but everyone, grown-ups in the room should acknowledge there are trade-offs. You don't want to make the cure worse than the disease. And I would argue that a Great Depression, a second Great Depression, is just that. So I'm hopeful that this data will show us some good signs. As you may have seen, there's governors both in the East Coast and the West Coast that are starting to form pacts on how to reopen the economy. So CNN reporting that New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, all those governors are starting to form a pack around Andrew Cuomo's direction. And then the same thing's happening over on the West Coast around Gavin Newsom. You got California, Washington, and Oregon also forming a pact to discuss when to reopen. So that's going on. And then finally, I think this I meant to cover this yesterday, but this gentleman named Stanley Chera, who's a real estate mogul in New York City, elderly guy. It just came out that he died of COVID-19, and there's some speculation that he was the friend that Trump was referring to in his recent pressers about a friend of his he knew in Queens who went in, tough guy, older, heavier set, preconditions, and he was in a coma within 24 hours of getting into the hospital. So that was sad news to find out if that's indeed who Trump was talking about. And when things take on a personal note for you, it doesn't matter what it is. Let's say it's the country's at war and you personally know somebody who's in the military who's going overseas to fight, or make it a little bit more come home. You know a family who lost a service member overseas to combat operations. That really drives it home for you. Until that time, it's on a screen. It's information getting fed to you through a newspaper, and there are numbers and maybe some names, and it doesn't have that personal connection. So I think this gentleman might have been the personal connection that convinced Trump that this was, no joke, something to be reckoned with. So, not that he didn't think it was serious before that. I can't read the guy's mind, but I just thought that interesting that came out yesterday. All right, so big talk on today's presser with the Trump team, and I thought this was fascinating. So I went and started tweeting about it. I didn't start tweeting about it. I started reading the tweets on it before I started to watch the presser, and I always watch them after they come out. I don't watch them live because it's too slow, and I've got 4 kids and not a lot of time, so I have to listen to everything on 2 times speed. I used to listen to it on 1.25, 1.5. Now it's 2 or 2.5. I got to get through stuff quick. And so I put the presser on two times speed after it was finished. and I kind of started to figure out what all the hubbub was about. So I heard, CNN and MSNBC cut off their coverage when Trump presented this video that showed their outlets and other news outlets basically downplaying the threat in January and February, and then also showing some clips of Democratic governors saying nice things about the administration's response. So, so these networks shut down the coverage at that point and didn't want to, you know, be a part of that, which is their right. And so, a lot of buzz and persuasion. Scott Adams says persuasion. 90% of persuasion is just getting attention, and obviously this got attention. So I went in there and I looked at the presser and I watched it. I didn't watch the whole thing. I watched about maybe half of it or so, and I thought that there was some interesting things that happened. I want to go through this in order. I'll get to the video here in a second, but my overall takeaway is that the press, the press and Trump and the public go into these pressers with different assumptions. This is my opinion. Okay, so I can't read anybody's mind, but my impression of the public is that they go into these pressers thinking that there's going to be some information that comes out that makes them feel more comfortable, that makes them helps them plan for the future financially, plan for the future with career, with family, with managing their affairs, travel, those kinds of things. So I think that's how the public comes into it. I think the press comes into it, not all, but some of the press comes into it with the intent of getting some pretty dicey, spicy headlines the next day that will sell papers or sell clicks, and so they have to be controversial. So that there's an incentive to do some gotcha questions. And then I think Trump comes into the press conference and his administration that this is an opportunity for them to get their narrative across to the American people, regardless of what the headlines say. And they'll do that through the form of questions. So the story is the presser, and you could probably do a comparison of how many people view the press release or the press conference versus how many people watch the CNN Don Lemon or watch the Chris Cuomo or watch Fox News or read the paper, how many clicks are in the New York Times the next day, the Washington Post, and whatnot. And I haven't seen the numbers, but just speculation. I would think that the actual press conference has the most viewership to get the real deal. So I think Trump knows this, and he goes in with the opportunity to basically sell his position, his narrative, his side to the American people, and to kind of combat in real time what he perceives as disinformation and fake news. So I think that that's the going in, and then all that tussle back and forth, the question answers, they're going to get spun into he's a monster versus he's exposing the fake media for what it is. If you read the two sides, um, and it can get very emotional very fast and very difficult to navigate very quickly. So that's kind of the setup. So I'm going to go through this in order. So first, I thought it was very interesting for Dr. Fauci to come out in the beginning and clarify the hypothetical question he was asked by Jake Tapper yesterday, which got him into some trouble, led to some rumors that Trump was going to fire him, and stirring the pot. Trump retweeted something that said, Fauci's got to go, which is kind of dumb, but gains attention. So Fauci clarified that, and then he also answered a couple questions. And I wrote some notes, and this is kind of paraphrased, but there's a question about pushback in the administration, and this is covering the January-February timeframe. Was there people giving you pushback? And the word pushback was used. And he said there's a lot of discussions without the president, with different people in the room, and no one was saying that we couldn't do this. No one was saying that. And every time that we went to the president, first with the travel to China, ban, he said yes. And then the travel to Europe, he said yes. And then the UK, he said yes. And then the 15 days mitigation, he said yes. And then the additional 30 days mitigation, he said yes. So from Fauci's perspective, Trump had said yes on every occasion in the meetings where he was influential in that discussion. So I thought that was interesting and really addressed the critique that Trump wasn't listening to his experts throughout this whole thing. Then Trump came up there and did the did the video, which was underwhelming for me. All the hype it had from the Twitter sphere, I saw it and I'm like, it's a little underwhelming. But I just find the outrage that it caused to be somewhat comical. And then he gave a timeline, which I thought was more effective. And he read it. There's a timeline in January and talked about how he was brutalized after closing off travel to China and doing a mandatory quarantine. It's called xenophobic by none other than Joe Biden, who called him a racist and a xenophobe from that decision. And he's the other candidate for president. And also, the video, what it did show was some governors praising Trump and his response. And so I thought it was interesting that he chose governors, particularly Democratic governors, who would say nice things about the administration. And I think what he was doing was cutting straight through all the muck directly to the American people. And he's saying, look, here are governors on the other side who said that we were doing a good job. Okay, that's not getting reported. What's getting reported is our other press conferences that the governors may have where they turn political and start to muddy the waters. But the conversations that happen, and he said this routinely, the conversations that happen on the phone and with the task force have been very pleasant and very positive, and there's been a lot of great feedback from the governors on the federal response. So I thought that was quite interesting, and I want to make a comment on the governors here in just a moment. Hopefully, I remember it, but it has to do with complimenting an adversary, and I'll talk about that in a second. So what's interesting is that he mentions, has there been any reporting on the numbers of ventilators and hospital beds being short? Has there been any reporting on that? Everybody who's needed a hospital bed has gotten it. Everybody who's needed a ventilator has gotten it. And our job as the federal response is to assess whether what the states are telling us they need is actually what they need, because we have limited stock. And so we don't want to give 20,000 ventilators to Iowa when they don't have anything happening right now. And New York City is where the hotspot is. So it makes sense from a structural standpoint to have a containment of the resources and an independent assessment of what the states are saying they need. And he was making a claim in his presentation that we did a good job assessing what the states actually needed versus what they said they needed in terms of hospital beds and ventilators. Now, I didn't talk about the other PPE, and there might be some criticism there that could still play out. So, so this brings me to my Twitter interchange with my buddy Justin. Single old skull sessions, Justin. I made a comment in this back and forth, and there was so many responses, so many replies. It probably was 50 replies, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I made a comment eventually that I think that Trump could deliver a baby in the lobby of Trump Tower. He could personally deliver a baby in the lobby of Trump Tower, and his critics would find a way to not compliment him. They would go out of their way to not compliment him. They would find something wrong with that scenario where they could not intellectually bring themselves to say good job. And so I tweeted that out there, and I think that it started to hold true in the conversation. So there's a lot made about the February question in this presser with I don't remember the woman reporter who was asking the question, where she was from, maybe CNN, but she was basically trying to not let him off the hook with perceived inaction in February from the response in January with China. The next thing that happened was March with the EU, with Europe, and then the UK. So we have this whole February thing, and then what happened in February? Well, the State of the Union was in February. The impeachment vote in the Senate was in February. The Nancy Pelosi on February 24th or 25th was saying, come to Chinatown, there's no issue. So there were things happening, but the criticism is that Trump wasn't stockpiling a bunch of things that we would supposedly need to fight this thing. And there may be some good lessons learned on that front. There certainly could have been things done better, and the CDC obviously has a lot to answer for with poor testing on the COVID-19 tests that didn't work, equipment that was not working either, that was broken or just unserviceable. So there's certainly some great lessons learned, but no one is talking about the legitimacy of the other side, which is, who's the first line responsibility for preparing for emergencies like this? Is it the federal government? Is it the states? I don't know. Uh, they both have roles, but what is the role? I don't think it's fair to say that if I'm a governor of a state, if there's an emergency, I should automatically assume that the federal government's going to fill all of my critical shortages. I don't know that that's the way to go. At the same time, I don't think that each state has total autonomy of either prepping their state for a disaster or not prepping their state for a disaster. So I don't know that the entire accountability should be left at the governorship level. So I think this raises a great question about preparedness that is a federalism type discussion. Okay, what's the role of the federal government? What's the role of the states? The federal agencies, FEMA and whatnot, the CDC, and state health officials. And I think that's the positive thing that's going to come out of all this is where does that balance lie? And obviously, Trump has presented his standpoint. Look, the states are the front line. They're supposed to buy the equipment. They're supposed to make sure they have enough PPE. We're supposed to be the backfill. So now we're getting blamed for not, for not filling the critical shortages in the states when it's the state's responsibility in the beginning. That's not getting discussed. Trump is trying to communicate that, but you don't really see a whole lot of investigative journalism about that particular point. It's kind of dismissed. Maybe it's a point worthy of dismissal. I don't know, but it hasn't been given a fair treatment necessarily, in my view. And I certainly haven't seen all the reporting, so maybe there's a reporter out there who gave it some fair treatment. But it seems to me there's a legitimate federal federalism type discussion about the role of the federal government versus the role of the state in this scenario. So, so all this to say that there's been a whole kitchen sink, a whole laundry list of things. Too much turnover, chaos in the administration, didn't listen to key advisors, didn't heed the memos, didn't like the fact that there was a warning written on paper, and then scolded the Navarro for writing it on a memo format versus verbally, and all these things, and there's all this evidence that piles up in people's minds that persuade them and convince them that this is all just a bumbling buffoonery of a thing. But if you dig down into these articles, and you critically look at all the reasons or the proofs given, they start to just disappear. They just start to disappear in light of context, in my view. So one example was, hey, look at the South Korea versus the U.S. and the testing differences and whatnot. We didn't have enough tests. Well, that's not necessarily all entirely on Trump. I mean, that could be on the administrative state, that could be on the CDC, that could be on the 2+ million bureaucrats that Trump did not hire, that just he inherited. So there's a lot of subtlety in the context to think about these issues. And we're the third largest by population country in the world, behind China and India. And South Korea is nowhere close to the number of people that we have. So for us to prepare for something like that is quite different than South Korea preparing for something like that. Plus, South Korea has been through this. So that, and then his rhetoric, his press conferences with what he said in public, trying to keep the public from panicking and reassure them. And this is the evidence. And you can certainly understand why a president would want to keep the public calm about a potential pandemic. So, with more charitable interpretations, or at least just allowing for other interpretations that might have equal weight, these things just start to disappear. And that's kind of my view. A lot of the critiques boil down to critics want to play HR in the White House. And look at the turnover and look at how he didn't do this. And he's got this personality conflict with this person. And there's this infighting and these people are obstructionists and these people were blocking and whatever, these people were pushing back on this. And Trump's trying to say, look, there's no playbook for this. This is shutting down the entire economy. And, you can't go in there and just willy-nilly shut down the entire economy. You got to know what you're doing, and you got to weigh the risks and play risk mitigation, play risk management, which most business owners will be familiar with, business people will be familiar with. If you're not familiar with that, then whichever way you go looks wrong, either economically or public health wise. So anyway, lots of back and forth. And at the end of the day, I said, hey, I asked my friend Justin. I said, hey, would you, what do you think? What would be selfless enough that we give him credit in your view? Like what thing would rise to the point where you would compliment him? And I thought his answer was pretty funny. Let's see. Okay. So here's, I just want to read you this thread. It's and we love each other. We're good friends. Okay. Whoops. Okay. So I asked him, I said, you think he's truly incapable? Okay. So let me just back up a little bit. So he tweeted this thing from Noah Schechtman. I'm not sure who he is, but he basically says Trump had a golden political opportunity and wasted it because, well, he's not capable of selflessness. So statement on selflessness, which him who one of my friends, Justin Bradshaw, who was going back and forth on a tweet with Trump. He's a critic. I'm a supporter, loosely a supporter, and so we go back and forth, have these big debates on Twitter about this. So he tweets this Noah Schechtman tweet, and he says, if Trump had seized this moment, his reputation would have been gold, possibly forever. He could have skated to re-election, and impeachment would have been a tiny asterisk. But Trump couldn't help himself. He couldn't rise to meet the crisis. Now he'll go down as the worst of the worst. So this is obviously opinion. So I responded, making assumptions about someone's inner thoughts is an error. You cannot make a claim like he's incapable of selflessness because it means you are reading his mind. Justin replies, I'm judging his actions. How about his actions show that he's incapable of selfless acts? And I said, you think he's truly incapable of selfless acts writ large? You don't see other explanations as plausible, or at least give you less confidence in yours? His response, it's irrelevant to debate whether he's capable of it or not. He doesn't do it, and actions speak louder than potential. And I questioned him, can you give me an example of something Trump in theory might do that would pass your test as a selfless act? That may clarify for me. So he said, divest from his companies. And then I asked him, he said a couple other things too. What else did he say? Stop tweeting, divest from his companies, release his tax returns without a court order. Okay, and I think that's the three things he gave me off the bat. So divest from his countries. I asked him, what about not taking a presidential salary? So I thought, would that be a selfless act? And his response, a symbolic gesture that seems to like a big deal to people who don't have any sense of scale. It's a drop in the bucket, a talking point. Do you think he's doing it to help the bottom line of the country? Seriously? So I replied, and this is kind of exactly what I was talking about. Thus, not worthy of consideration. Like I said, delivering a baby in the lobby of Trump Tower, literally nothing would garner a comment of praise from certain critics. So, the tax returns, I said, well, he's the richest person to ever get elected president. There's, whatever he does to release his tax returns, whichever way it goes, there could be nothing, there could be something, but you can just play this game in your head. You absolutely know, it's predictable, that the headlines the next day after the tax returns are released, whether forcefully or not, are going to be negative. They're going to make, they're going to be, there's going to be a narrative that is going to be Trump is as rich as he claimed he was, so he was lying, or there's this business dealing, and there's so much business dealings with billionaires, so many that you could narrow down on any one thing and remove the context, find something, and then that's the headline, and then boom, there's a negative headline on Trump's tax returns. So it's just way too predictable. So anyway, I thought that interchange was entertaining. Some other people thought it was entertaining. I did get a tweet recently, as in the last couple minutes, from somebody who was, I guess, observing us. I'm not sure. Uh, okay, I agree with that. So, so anyway, my big thing is you should be skeptical when emotion gets in it. Like I said at the beginning of this discussion, I have increasingly gotten to the point where I believe that humans are 80 to 90% emotionally driven and only about 10 to 20% reason driven or rationally driven. Um, so you want to get somebody to commit, and a lot of salespeople know this. You want to get somebody to commit to a sale, uh, appeal to their emotion because it's going to end up being an emotional decision anyway. Persuade somebody in an argument, you could use reason and the best arguments, flawless, deductive, inductive arguments you can possibly think of. And at the end of the day, it's going to be an emotional decision on the opposing side that's going to ultimately open them up to your point of view. So with high emotion, just what I would say is be careful because it could be blinding. And this cuts always, even for me. It could be blinding you of some relevant facts, relevant things that might be pertinent to reality and the conversation. And one thing that I think has really come out of this last 3.5 years is we've just learned how prone we are to, as a public and as people, to just fall hook, line, and sinker for certain narratives that we as the public look at uncritically. The context is removed. We don't have time to look up the context, and then that starts to slowly over time build this picture, build this narrative that could be highly in error, really highly in error. And I would submit that that's the case today. There's a lot of people in the U.S. that have a very strong narrative, a very emotionally charged narrative that is in error. And with that, I think I will. There's a couple other things I was going to talk about, but I've been yabbering for almost an hour. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please make some comments. I hope that you have a great night and a great Tuesday, and I will talk to you later.